Here I'll take the very first steps describing a model of first demand and then just a couple words about supply, just to get our feet wet and get some of the vocabulary uh, under our fingertips as we start to talk about this. So here's a typical flow chart people give. This is really the demand side of the model, sort of follow the money. So the arrows you can think of as that's spending or money flowing from one place to another. So the two big parts of an economy are the business sector, businesses, firms, and households, people. So people spend money and buy stuff from firms, so that's consumption. But they also work for the firms, and so they get income coming out of that. Now that could be this national income. That could be a lot of things. Of course, part of that is wages. People work, make wages, salaries. Um, if you're a sole proprietor, though, that could be profits. If you're running a hot dog stand, you're a business and a household all in one. So the profits flow from your business to your household from your hot dog stand. Benefits are also part of that. The health insurance that you get with a job. So that money comes over to the household sector. Now, the money coming out is not exactly the same as the money going in because of the government here. This public sector is the government. Now, of course, they take their cut of taxes, but they send some stuff back out. Things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security spending, some kinds of direct, things like food stamps, some direct benefits like that. So those all go under transfers. So they take some, they put some back in. So the money that actually makes it to the household is what we call disposable income, the actual money the household has to spend. Now they turn around and spend some of that. Of course, they don't spend all of it. Some of it is consumption, but some of it is saved. And so this goes into the financial sector. And what comes out of the financial sector is what we call investment. Now, this is one word we have to be real careful about. Usually, if I say the word investment, most people think, buying stocks and bonds to save for the future, or save for retirement, or save for something. That's the finance version. In macro, investment means business spending. Businesses buying computers, or building a new factory, or buying pencils. Some kind of business spending. And it comes out of the financial sector because usually, the money that the business gets when they build a new factory, they have to either take a loan or maybe issue stock, maybe issue bonds. One of those ways of raising capital, which is another word we need to be careful about. In the capital for businesses is money to spend. Capital for macro is something different altogether. So I should be careful with that word too. Now, of course, the government spends money here. And then, there's exports and imports. When we import things, money goes out to the rest of the world. When we export stuff, money comes back. We're not going to worry too much about this. It's good to remind ourselves that it's there. But for this class, we're really not going to do a whole lot with that. Okay, so when we start our model, when we start to build our model, one of the first things we'll do is write down some equations saying, well, if I want to know all the money going to the business sector, I have to add up, these three things. So this will be our starting point. One other lesson to be taken from this is ask yourself, what is GDP here? Or what should I be looking at? Well, GDP is all goods and services produced. Everything the business that people buy and use, goods and services. Well, one way you could look at that is say, well, what's all the money flowing into the business sector? Like, this is people buying stuff from firms. So if you just add all that up, the C, I, and G, and imports minus exports, actually, then just adding up all the money flowing into the business sector, that's one way to think about GDP. But if this is really all the money coming out of the business sector, this should be the same thing. So GDP and income should be the same thing. So that's one complication right up front when we're talking about GDP, is GDP has this dual role. It's both the sum of expenditures, but it's also total income. So that's something that's one advantage we have in trying to keep track of all this, but it's also one complication that we have to deal with all the time. Okay, now where does policy fit into this? Where does I said the government has options for what to do, that things that affect the economy or that are part of the economy. Now, all this spending that I just said and tax policy, so the government they buy fighter jets, they buy healthcare services, they buy all kinds of things. So in the flow chart, that's all this G, this spending coming out here. And the taxes and transfers, that's more, that's the revenue and what they call tax expenditures for things like Social Security. So exactly how they do that, that's another question if we're talking about fiscal policy. What should the government do? Well, how much should they spend? What should they spend it on? How much taxes do they need to raise? How should they do it? And of course, how much they spend and how much they tax, determines what the deficit is and what the eventual government debt is. So that's all fiscal policy. So that's that shows up on our flow chart in a pretty straightforward way. It's right in here, this public sector. That's, people say public sector as opposed to the private sector. But there's a whole other part to policy. So fiscal policy, some of you might think, might know the other end of this. The other big player in macro policy is the Federal Reserve. And they control the money supply and interest rates, and of course what interest rates are affects decisions consumers make about what to buy, and especially things like housing and big ticket items they'd have to borrow for. But also of course firms as well. Firms, businesses take loans to expand all the time, so that's a big part too. Now, it's not quite as obvious where that is here. Where would I put the Fed if I was going to put it on this chart? Well, right here with the financial sector. So the Fed is just, what they're really doing a lot of the time is buying and selling things like bonds from other banks. So they're just part of a lot of what they're doing is just kind of being a player in the financial sector, buying and selling things just like other banks and financial institutions do. to try, as I said, try to influence interest rates or the money supply. So that's one question is, well, what should they focus on? It turns out they can't really do both at once. If they want to, if if they want to fix an interest rate, if they want to say the federal funds rate is 3%, that means they're going to have to give up some control of what the money supply is. And if they want money supply growth to be 4%, they're going to have to give up some control of interest rates. So they've got a choice right there. So what should they choose? And then once they choose that, what should they do? Now the Jerome Powell, of course, is the man in command of the Fed. And what is he thinking about when he decides about what to do with interest rates? So the easy way to keep this straight is all this fiscal policy, that's things that Congress and the president do. And monetary policy is what the Federal Reserve does. So, like I said, this flow chart is really about the demand sector, about tracking all the spending that goes on. Now, of course, the supply end of it is another big part of it. What goes into the decisions about how much stuff to make? And the way we typically think about this in macro is to think about the supply sector like it's one big firm, one big business, and just track all the inputs and outputs. So this is the starting point for most discussions in macro, just a production function here. So the F is the function, and this is the K and the L are the inputs. So that's capital and labor. So everybody knows what labor is. That's the number of people that firms hire, and capital is really everything else. So when you say capital, most people think, well, the factory or the machinery or something like that. But it's really everything that goes into that. It could be the organizational details. It could be the insurance that you need to start production. So anything you have to spend on, any input you have to spend on besides labor, we lump into capital. Now all that stuff goes in, and this Y is output. And of course that the word for that we've already used is GDP. So if our economy, we're thinking about it as one big firm, and this is all the stuff that's produced, that's GDP. So this is really another way to look at GDP. You can look at it as all the expenditures that people make, all the stuff people buy, all the income that people receive, or all the goods that are produced by all the firms. So GDP really does stand in for a lot of things here. Now what about this A here? I put this just as a preliminary. So this says, well, there might be some other reasons why a firm or a country that has the same inputs might have a different output. So think about how would that be? How could you have if you had two countries that had sort of the same level of infrastructure, the same number of people, the same infrastructure and things like highways and airports and machines and factories, but one country could produce more stuff than the other. Why would that be? Well, this is the A is the magic word that goes along with this is productivity. So it could be things like technology. Maybe one country has, they have the same, you could have the same machines, but if you have better technology, to use those machines, maybe you can produce more stuff. Or maybe your workers are better. Maybe your workers are better educated, better trained. Maybe they're more motivated. So all of that, anything you can kind of lump in there, that goes in with the A as productivity. Okay, so that's quick overview of sort of when we start to model supply and demand. Those are going to be our starting points.